Hello again. Welcome to our second stab at considering the topic of apologetics. Last week, we looked at a couple of different aspects of apologetics. We looked at 1 Peter chapter 3, really zeroing in on verse 15. But in your hearts, honor Christ, the Lord is holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. So the study of apologetics is that being prepared part. He said always being prepared to make a defense. And so we want to spend some time as a church thinking about that very thing. And so last week we looked at that. We jumped over to Athens and hung out with Paul in Acts 17, where we got to see him kindly, clearly articulate the gospel. So he could have got drawn into a bunch of different fights about the difference between Jews and the Athenians, but he didn't go there. He didn't go into all the social things that he was frustrated with. He zeroed in and helped clearly communicate the resurrection and the core of the gospel. He also did that by making connections to their idolatrous God that they said an unknown God. So he made that connection. He even quoted their own prophets and poets. So he was paying attention. He was listening. He was ready to go. He didn't tear them down, but he clearly connected what he was talking about to them. And so we want to be more mindful about that. That's why we looked at wisdom and humility. We want to make sure that we're doing this. We looked at the Proverbs. We want to be mindful. We want to be listening. We don't want to tear each other and the other people down. We're not trying to manipulate or trick. We are trying to look for the best in what the other person's saying, so that way we can genuinely have an actual conversation. So those are some good aspects that we looked at together. Now we're going to jump into some other content from our authors. This is the book Apologetics at the Cross. They did a fantastic job walking us through, and so we're highlighting some great stuff, knowing that you might not have time to read the whole book, and so we wanted to give you some of our great stuff. Josh Hayes at Gateway Night back in October covered a lot of this great content, and now we're kind of continuing to dive in. It's good to have a starting place, because sometimes when you're doing this and having conversations, when it comes to really important things, they're so foundational that we have a hard time finding a good starting place. David Foster Wallace gave the commencement address at Kenyon College in 2005. Wallace was an incredible novelist, but in his talk, he said this. He said, "There's these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, 'Morning, boys, how's the water?' And the two young fish swim on for a bit. Then eventually one of them looks at the other and goes, 'What the heck is water?' The point of the fish story is merely that the most obvious, important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about." So here we are, fish trying to describe water. And so it's good to kind of have a starting place. Our authors give us this framework of inside out. So we want a couple questions to ask about a person's thought process inside their own system of belief. And then a couple questions that lead them out of that into ours to help make those connections. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at these 4 questions to get the content from the book. Then we're going to jump over and look at how those 4 questions might look on a particular topic. So we'll look at an example. And then you're going to launch into your small group discussion, where you're going to take these questions even further and kind of practice with one another. We know that typically on a small group night, we're used to reading a passage and talking. This will be a little bit more interactive, but I think a really helpful way to get at this together. Our first question is an inside question, and it's this: what can we affirm and what do we need to challenge? Our authors say this: the most beneficial approach is to first affirm the aspects of the other person's position that you find admirable, and then to identify points that are impractical or inconsistent. We've already seen an example of this approach in Paul's speech in Athens, where Paul finds points of contact with the pagan culture and also challenges their perspective. So again, this isn't mean-spirited, but it's pretty normal in conversation, right? Hey, here are some places where I can affirm, but what about this? Or Have you ever thought of that? The next is, where does this lead? So this is a really helpful way to kind of push people to say, okay, play that out. Again, it's not that we're trying to trick them or we're trying to prove them wrong. We're trying to help them describe the water they're swimming in. Just like it would be hard for us. If we were talking to somebody, we'd want someone to give us some space to work that out. Even though we deeply believe what we believe, it takes a minute. So what we're doing is we're trying to say, okay, push that out a little bit. Where does it lead? Our authors say this. One way to help others see their blind spots is to trace out where their assumptions and beliefs will ultimately lead if they are applied consistently. Fallen cultures often contain assumptions that make Christianity seem implausible, yet those who hold these assumptions usually haven't worked them out in their head. These assumptions are, after all, the very air they breathe. Because of this, by asking questions and discussing the implications of certain views, an apologist can expose those views as overly simplistic or unlivable. So here we're just trying to ask some questions and say, hey, step all the way down on that. Does it hold you? Now, if it does, that's great. Then we can continue to have that conversation. But what we find is also a lot of the people we work with kind of are working with some assumptions that aren't necessarily helpful. And so this can be a way to lead them and walk with them as they figure that out. After we do 2 inside questions, here's 2 outside questions to look at. The first, where do competing narratives borrow from the Christian story? The reality is we live in a post-Christendom world. So when I say Christendom, that is when there was a time when everything kind of was structured and connected to, Christians in charge over here in the West. That time's over, but the remnants are still in the water. And so sometimes, actually oftentimes, there's a competing narrative that borrows from Christianity, and it's great to kind of start to point those things out so that way we can make some of those connections. And again, to point out where on their own, without Christ, they don't actually work. Having listened carefully to take inventory of what can be affirmed and what needs to be challenged in an unbeliever's view, we will be positioned to show how the Christian story includes vital resources that, though they may be present in the unbeliever's framework, are actually borrowed from Christianity, since their framework does not have anything to ground such resources. And finally, our last outside question, how does Christianity better address our experiences, observations, and history? So here's what we want to say, according to our authors. How does Christianity better capture the rich texture of this life and history? Being able to answer this question in conversations and connect human and cultural aspirations to Christianity is directly related to having a rich understanding of the gospel. This is where we get a chance to say, hey, I hear you. Here's why this makes the most sense to me. And so we want to be ready and prepared to make that connection. We don't want to just kind of listen to what they're saying and then just leave it there. That would be like a one-sided phone call. We want to genuinely have a conversation. Now, again, this is all built on trust and relationship, and this person actually, wants to have this conversation. So we need to be ready to not just listen, but when the time's right, make those connections and then show what we believe in ways that are clear and make the path straight, as we saw with John the Baptist. Now, let's play this out a little bit. Let's just say hypothetically, I was talking to my friend Ursula, who isn't quite sure what she believes about Jesus, but loves talking about justice. So the first, looking at our first insight question, what can we affirm and what do we need to challenge? So here we would be able to say to people, hey, I agree, people should be treated fairly. We could stretch that out into a great conversation of here are the ways in which we both see the world as fundamentally broken, where it's not fair. It's good that people value justice. But then let's keep going. What do we need to challenge? Well, hey, without God, who gets to decide which rights people have? This would be a really interesting question to ask people. Well, now, wait a minute. How do we decide which rights people have? The second insight question is this: where does it lead? And the fun thing is, it does seem that whoever's in charge has power and gets to decide which rights people have. However, aren't there some rights that exist no matter what? Now we can start to push through. If without a God, how do people decide which rights people have? Ultimately, it's usually just whoever's is in charge. But if we really think there's something innate about human rights, we have to understand, well, where is that sourced? Where does that come from? So again, this could be a great conversation to have and simply ask questions. This leads us to our outside questions. Where do competing narratives borrow from the Christian story? The idea that someone has rights and values no matter what actually comes from religion. In Scripture, every human has value because they are created in God's image. If the world is random, if it was created out of nothingness, if the Big Bang, if something just appeared out of nothing, and then the world just played out, we're just molecules and atoms bouncing around, can you really make a case for human rights? In fact, the reason why in the West we have this framework of justice and rights is rooted in religion. Both ancient Western religions that had some sense of right or wrong because they were determined by God. And certainly the Judeo-Christian framework has heavily influenced our understanding of what's fair and right. This idea that we would lift up love is a fundamentally Christian virtue. And the reason why it's in the water that we all are swimming in is because of the Christian story. You can't just remove Christianity and still get to those same places. And so it's helpful to help make that connection for people. Wait a minute, if there really is no God, well, how can you actually say that love is this high value, that people have value, if they're just globs of matter? Finally, how does Christianity better address our experiences, observations, and history? Rather than being determined by other humans, Christians believe that God has created us in his image. In our sin, we will always hurt others, and knowing about human rights will not be enough to preserve them. No law can make us perfect. Knowing this, God became human in Jesus. He took our injustice on himself so we could finally be free. Notice that this last question, this is my chance to not just, we took about some ideas, but now I want to kind of launch in and say, here's the how this makes sense inside the Christian framework. So I try to clearly communicate the gospel, both that, we believe that we're made in God's image, that sin makes us an unjust people, that simply knowing about human rights won't actually fix it. Sin is not just an education problem, but it's this fundamental broken, we're wholly broken. And so knowing this, God became a human in Jesus, took his injustice on himself. He literally, died unjustly on the cross, falsely accused, and yet took our death on himself and gave us his life. Notice I didn't talk about other social issues or other things that I think are unjust. Instead, we use that framework. Of course, we could talk about those other things, but the idea is that we use that framework to ultimately point people to the cross. People can encounter and understand the gospel, then all that other stuff comes next. All right, so we looked at this as a conversation piece together. Now we're going to launch in our small groups and look at kind of this idea of, hey, how can there only be one religion? So there's a couple different ways you're going to look at this together in conversation, continuing to play with these ideas, looking at these inside and outside questions, and then we'll see what happens. I'll be praying for you. I hope group goes great. We'll see you next time.